The restraints on my limbs are not tight, but I do not try to move. 3 of them sit across the table from me, and none of them blink the way my own kind blinks. I have been asked the same question 4 times now. What happened to the 9th Fleet? I will answer it once more, fully, because I think they still do not understand what they are asking me to explain. My name does not matter here. What matters is that I was a signal officer aboard a coalition cruiser, and I watched an entire war unravel in less than 1 season of their planet's turning. I have seen my superiors die confused. I have seen strategies built over 1,000 years fail in a single afternoon, and I am the only one from my ship who can still speak about it. Before any of this happened, we did not think of the humans as a threat. We had read the reports. A single star system, 1 inhabited world, a species barely past the point of leaving their own atmosphere in large numbers. Our fleet database listed them under the same category as a dozen other young species we had folded into the coalition without much resistance. Send ships. Show strength. Wait for the surrender signal. Move on to the next system. I remember the briefing before we entered their system. The commanding officer, a broad-shouldered veteran named Threll, stood in front of a star chart and told us this would be a short posting. He said humans fight each other constantly, over land, over resources, over ideas that do not even exist as objects. He said a species that cannot agree among itself will not be able to organize against an outside force. He said we would be home before the next supply rotation. I believed him. Everyone on that ship believed him, because everything in our long history supported it. We had absorbed species that built empires larger than anything humans had ever built. We had absorbed species with technology that outpaced humanity's by centuries. Every single one of them had done the sensible thing when faced with a fleet like ours. They had stopped fighting. Our first ships entered human space without any resistance at all. We saw their orbital stations, their satellites, their scattered defense platforms, and none of it looked like a serious obstacle. We broadcast our standard message. Compliance ensures continuation. Resistance ensures nothing. It is the same message we had sent to every species before them, translated into their primary tongues within hours by our linguistic systems. There was no response. At first we assumed this was simply a delay, the kind of hesitation a small government might have while its leaders argued over what to do. Threll ordered us to hold position and wait 1 full rotation of their homeworld before considering the silence itself a form of defiance. I remember the bridge that day. Calm. Almost bored. A few officers made comments about how they hoped this posting would end quickly so they could return to their families across the coalition worlds. When the rotation ended, we received no formal reply. Instead, our sensors detected movement. Not a diplomatic ship. Not an escape convoy fleeing the system in surrender, which is what we had seen from other species in similar situations. It was a war fleet, and it was already in motion before we had even finished processing their silence. I want to explain how strange this felt to us. In our long experience, no species had ever mobilized this quickly. Most civilizations needed weeks to convert their industry into full military production once they understood the scale of what faced them. Humans had ships in formation within a single rotation of first contact. It was as if they had been expecting a war before they ever knew we existed. Threll was not concerned. He told the crew that a fast reaction did not mean a capable one. He said many young species panic and throw ships forward without proper coordination, and that panic is easy to defeat. He ordered our fleet to hold its formation, to let the human ships approach, and to demonstrate the kind of controlled strength that ends conflicts before they properly begin. I was monitoring communications when the human fleet came within engagement range. There was still no formal transmission from their leadership, no demand, no negotiation, nothing that fit our understanding of how a young species behaves when facing overwhelming force. What we picked up instead were fragments, voices between their ships, calm, almost conversational, giving each other small pieces of information, positions, distances, names of places I did not recognize, spoken like something worth protecting. One voice stayed with me longer than the others, a woman's voice, steady, giving instructions to what sounded like a much younger crew member. Her name, I would later learn, was Grace Turner. I did not know then that I would hear that name again under very different circumstances. Threll gave the order to engage using our standard formation, the same approach that had ended a dozen conflicts before this one without significant coalition losses. Our ships moved forward with confidence, expecting the human fleet to either retreat once they understood the difference in our capabilities, or to be reduced quickly enough that any further resistance would become pointless. Neither of those things happened. The human ships did not hold a clean formation the way our own doctrine expected. They scattered, then reformed at odd angles, using their own vessels as partial cover for each other, in patterns that looked disorganized at first glance, but were not disorganized at all. Our sensor operators struggled to build a clear targeting picture because the humans kept changing their spacing in ways that seemed to have no fixed pattern. I remember the first exchange of weapons fire. It should have been simple. Our lead ships had firepower that outmatched anything in their fleet several times over, and yet within minutes, 2 of our escort vessels reported serious damage, not because the humans had stronger weapons, but because they had aimed for very specific, very small points on our hulls that our own defense systems were slow to protect. They were not firing randomly. They were firing like they already understood exactly how our ships were built. Threll ordered a second wave forward, expecting the pressure to break their nerve. It did not break. If anything, their formation tightened, and their smaller vessels began moving in ways that put them directly between our main line and something they were clearly trying to protect. I did not understand it fully in that moment. I understand it now. They were buying time for something else to happen. That something else arrived without warning, a group of vessels rising from what our sensors had marked as empty space near one of their outer moons, vessels that had been sitting completely dark and silent, waiting for the exact moment our main fleet committed itself to the engagement. By the time we detected them, they were already inside our formation. I will not describe every detail of what followed, because some of it does not need to be repeated in full. What I will say is this. Within a short span of time, 3 of our escort ships lost primary power. 2 more reported critical damage to essential systems. And Threll, for the first time since I had served under him, gave an order to fall back and reassess. It was the first time in coalition history, according to records I saw later, that a fleet of our size had been forced to retreat from a species we had classified as primitive. I remember the silence on the bridge after that order was given. Nobody spoke. Threll stood staring at the display where the human fleet held its position, not pursuing us, not celebrating, simply holding their ground as if they had expected this outcome from the very beginning. We pulled back to a defensive distance and began repairs, and it was during that quiet period that I first understood something none of our reports had prepared me for. The humans were not fighting like a species trying to survive one battle. They were fighting like a species that had already decided, long before we arrived, exactly how a war like this needed to be fought. Threll called another briefing. This time his voice did not carry the same certainty it had before. He told us that our approach needed to change, that whatever assumptions we had built our strategy on were clearly incomplete. He asked for suggestions, which was unusual for him, and for a long moment nobody in that room had one to offer. I sat in that briefing thinking about the voice I had heard earlier, the calm woman giving instructions to a younger crew member in the middle of what should have been a hopeless fight against an overwhelming force. There had been no panic in her voice, no fear that stopped her from doing her work, only focus. I did not know it then, but that focus was going to define everything that happened to us over the following weeks. We had come expecting a short posting and an easy resolution. What we found instead was a species that treated the arrival of an unstoppable force not as a reason to surrender, but as a problem to be solved, calmly, precisely, and without hesitation. Threll ended that briefing by telling us to prepare for a longer engagement than any of us had expected. I remember thinking at the time that he was being overly cautious. I did not yet understand that he was one of the few people on that ship who had already begun to sense the truth. We were not dealing with a young species that would eventually understand the wisdom of surrender. We were dealing with something that did not carry that instinct at all. The repairs took longer than Threll wanted, and during that time, I was assigned to help process incoming data from our damaged escort ships. It was tedious work, sorting through sensor logs and trying to understand exactly how the humans had managed to strike so precisely during the first engagement. What I found in those logs disturbed me more than the damage itself. The human ships had not been guessing. Somewhere in the earliest exchanges of the battle, they had identified the exact locations of our power conduits, our shield generators, and our communication arrays, all from a single pass of sensor contact. No coalition species had ever reverse-engineered our systems that quickly. Most took months of careful study, often with captured equipment, before they understood our ship designs well enough to target them with any precision. I brought this to the attention of one of the senior analysts, a quiet older officer named Vesa, who had served through several previous conflicts. She looked at the data for a long time before speaking. She told me that this was not reverse engineering. This was pattern recognition of a kind she had never seen before. The humans, she said, were not analyzing our ships the way an engineer studies a machine. They were analyzing us the way a hunter studies an animal, looking for the places where the body is weakest, regardless of what that body is made of. I did not fully understand her meaning until the second engagement began. Threll had adjusted our formation based on what we learned from the first battle, spreading our ships further apart to reduce the effectiveness of any hidden strike force, and reinforcing the systems the humans had targeted most successfully. He believed this would be enough to restore our advantage. For a while, it seemed like he might be right. The second battle began differently. Our fleet held a wider formation, and our sensor operators kept a much closer watch on the surrounding space, wary of another hidden group of vessels. The human fleet approached in a much more direct line this time. No scattering, no odd repositioning, simply a straightforward advance that looked, for the first time, like something our doctrine could actually handle. I remember feeling a small measure of relief when I saw this. I remember thinking that perhaps the first battle had been a fortunate surprise for them, something that could not be repeated now that we understood their tactics. I was wrong, and I was wrong in a way that still troubles me now. The human fleet's direct approach was not a mistake, it was bait. As our lead ships moved to intercept, 3 of the human vessels broke away from the main formation and moved on a course that seemed, at first glance, to be a retreat. Our tactical officers debated whether to pursue them or hold the line, and Threll made the decision to hold, believing this was an attempt to draw part of our fleet away from the main body. It was not an attempt to draw us away. It was an attempt to draw our attention away from what those 3 ships were actually doing, which was moving into a position between our fleet and the debris field left behind from the first battle, a field made up of the wreckage from our own damaged escort ships and several destroyed human vessels as well. I did not understand what they were doing until our sensors detected multiple small objects emerging from that debris field, moving toward our formation at high speed. They were not weapons in the traditional sense. They were pieces of wreckage, human and coalition alike, fitted with small propulsion systems and enough basic guidance to be aimed with reasonable accuracy. The humans had turned the remains of the first battle, including pieces of our own ships, into a weapon against us. It should not have worked. Our defense systems were built to intercept organized weapons fire, not scattered debris moving on individual trajectories. And yet the sheer number of objects, combined with the confusion of our sensors trying to distinguish real threats from harmless wreckage, allowed several pieces to strike our ships directly. It was not devastating on its own, but it forced our formation to break in order to avoid further impacts, and a broken formation was exactly what the main human fleet needed. They struck the gaps in our line with a precision that told me they had planned this exact sequence of events from the very beginning, not as a reaction to our formation, but as an assumption of how we would respond once our formation was forced to move. I was at my station when the ship shook for the first time. Systems across several decks reported damage, and Threll's voice came over the internal channel, steady despite everything happening around us, giving orders to redirect power and hold position as long as possible. I remember admiring him in that moment, even as I understood that we were losing. It was during this chaos that a smaller human vessel closed the distance to our own ship, faster than any of our defense systems expected. I did not understand the purpose of this until it was already alongside us, and I heard the sound of something attaching itself to our hull, followed by a series of controlled breaches that our own security systems struggled to seal in time. They were not trying to destroy us. They were trying to board us. I remember Threll's voice giving the order for all non-essential personnel to move toward the inner sections of the ship, away from the breach points, while security teams moved to intercept. I followed that order along with several other officers, moving through corridors that had gone dark in places where power had been redirected to more critical systems. I did not make it to the inner sections before the breach teams reached our level. I want to describe this moment carefully, because it is the moment everything I believed about humans changed. I had expected, based on everything I had read and everything Threll had told us, that a boarding action from a species we considered primitive would be chaotic, driven by anger or desperation. What I saw instead was controlled and quiet. There were 4 of them, moving through the corridor in a formation that left no obvious weak point, each one watching a different angle, communicating with small hand signals rather than shouted commands. I recognized the woman leading them from her voice alone, the same steady tone I had heard during the first engagement, Grace Turner. I did not resist when they found me. I had no weapon, and I understood immediately that resistance would accomplish nothing against a team moving with that level of coordination. Grace Turner looked at me for a long moment before speaking, and her words were simple. She asked if I was armed. I told her I was not. She nodded, and one of her team members restrained me without unnecessary force, then moved on to continue securing the corridor. I expected to be left there, or perhaps removed from the ship entirely once their objective was completed. Instead, I was brought along with them as they continued their sweep, kept close but not harmed, while they worked to disable key systems throughout the ship rather than destroy it outright. I asked at one point why they had not simply destroyed the vessel from a distance, given the damage they had already caused. Grace Turner answered without looking away from her work. She said that a destroyed ship tells you nothing, but a disabled ship, and the people who once served on it, can tell you everything you need to know for the next fight. I remember thinking, at the time, that this was a strange kind of mercy. I understand now that it was not mercy at all. It was efficiency. They were not trying to spare us. They were trying to learn from us, the same way they had learned from the wreckage of the first battle, folding every piece of information into whatever came next. By the time their boarding action was complete, our ship had been fully disabled, its weapons and primary systems shut down in a way that left it intact but powerless. Threll was among those taken into their custody, along with myself and a handful of surviving crew members. I do not know what became of most of my former crewmates in the days that followed, only that I was separated from them shortly after being brought aboard a much larger human vessel. I remember looking back at our own ship as we were moved away from it, dark and silent, drifting without power in the same space where we had once expected an easy victory. It did not look like the end of a battle. It looked like the beginning of something we had not yet understood. I did not know, at that point, how much more there was to learn. The human vessel I was taken to was larger than I expected, though still smaller than our own cruisers, built with a kind of practical simplicity that favored function over display. There was no attempt to intimidate prisoners with the size or grandeur of the ship. Everything about it seemed designed to do exactly what it needed to do, and nothing more. I was placed in a secure area along with a handful of other coalition survivors, including Threll, though we were kept in separate compartments and not permitted to speak directly with one another. For the first several days, I expected some form of interrogation, the kind our own forces would have conducted with captured enemies. Instead, what I received was something closer to observation. A man named Daniel Hart was the first to speak with me at length. He introduced himself simply, without any of the formal titles I expected from a military officer, and asked if I required anything for basic comfort, whether the temperature of my compartment was suitable, whether I needed food adjusted to my species' requirements. I remember being confused by this, expecting questions about our fleet's strength or our coalition's plans, not questions about whether I was comfortable. I asked him directly why he was not interrogating me. He told me that a frightened prisoner gives bad information, and that he would rather understand me as I actually was, than force answers out of me that might not be true. I did not fully trust this explanation at first, believing it was simply a different strategy aimed at the same goal. Over the following days, I began to understand that Daniel Hart's approach was not unusual among the humans I encountered. There was a woman named Laura Bennett who worked in what I came to understand was their medical section, and she treated the injuries several of us had sustained during the boarding action with the same care she clearly gave to her own injured crew members. I asked her once why she bothered treating enemies who had come to conquer her people. She told me that a wound does not know which side it belongs to, and that she had taken an oath long before this war began to treat what needed treating. It was during this period that I began to notice something that unsettled me more deeply than any weapon or tactic I had witnessed in battle. The humans around me were not without fear. I could see it in small things, a slight tightness in Daniel Hart's shoulders when alarms sounded elsewhere on the ship, a brief pause in Laura Bennett's hands when she received news of casualties from another vessel in their fleet. They were afraid, constantly, in ways that our own soldiers were trained to suppress entirely. And yet that fear did not stop them from doing anything. It did not slow their work, did not weaken their resolve, did not make them hesitate when difficult decisions needed to be made. I began to understand that fear, for humans, was not something to be eliminated before action could be taken. It was simply a constant companion that they had learned to work alongside. I asked Daniel Hart about this directly one evening, during one of the longer conversations we shared while he monitored my compartment. I asked him how his people could fight so effectively while clearly carrying so much fear within them. He was quiet for a long moment before answering. He told me that humans had never known a long period without conflict of some kind, not in all of their recorded history. He said that every generation of his people had faced war, disaster, or hardship severe enough to threaten their survival, and that somewhere along the way, they had learned that waiting for fear to disappear before acting was a luxury they had never been allowed to have. I did not fully understand the weight of this statement until later, when I was permitted limited access to some of the historical records they kept aboard the ship, shared with me not as a form of demonstration, but simply because I had asked, and because none of them seemed to see any reason to hide it from me. What I found in those records disturbed me more than anything I had witnessed in battle. Their history was a continuous chain of conflict, interrupted only briefly and only in scattered regions, never as a single unbroken piece across their entire species. They had fought each other over land, over belief, over resources, in numbers and with a persistence that no coalition species had ever displayed in our own long history of expansion. And yet, throughout all of that conflict, they had also built things, medicine that saved lives even in the middle of their wars, structures that stood for centuries, art and stories that survived destruction and were carried forward by each new generation. I began to understand that humans did not see peace and conflict as opposites the way our own species did. For us, war was an aberration, a temporary failure of diplomacy that would eventually be corrected. For humans, conflict was simply a condition they lived within, something to be managed and endured, rather than something that could ever be permanently solved. This realization troubled me more than any tactic or weapon I had witnessed, because it meant that everything Threll had told us before our arrival was not simply incorrect, but was built on an assumption that could never have been true. He had told us that a species divided against itself could not organize against an outside threat. What I now understood was that humans had spent their entire history organizing against threats, both from each other and from their own environment, and that an external enemy was simply another version of a problem they already knew how to face. I spent time during this period with a younger crew member named Oliver Finch, barely more than a child by human standards, who had been assigned to bring food to the prisoners under guard. He was quieter than the others, and I asked him once whether he was afraid of the war continuing, whether he wished for it to end quickly. He told me that he was afraid every single day, and that he did not think that fear would ever fully leave him, even if the war ended tomorrow, but he said this without any resentment in his voice, as though it were simply a fact about his life, no different from the color of his eyes or the sound of his own voice. I began to see, through conversations like this, that the humans around me were not exceptional individuals selected for their bravery or their coldness in the face of danger. They were, by their own admission, ordinary people who had simply been raised within a history that never allowed fear to become an excuse for inaction. This was not a trait bred into a select group of soldiers. It appeared to be woven into the entire culture, passed down through generations who had never known anything different. I remember a conversation with Laura Bennett that stayed with me longer than any other. She had lost someone close to her during the second battle, a fact I learned only because I noticed she had grown quieter over several days, and eventually asked Daniel Hart what had happened. When I later spoke with her directly and offered what I understood to be an appropriate expression of sympathy, she thanked me, but told me something I did not expect. She said that grief and duty were not enemies for her people. She said you could carry both at the same time, and that setting one aside to make room for the other was never something she had been taught to do. This idea, that a person could hold grief and continued action within themselves simultaneously, without one canceling out the other, was foreign to everything our own coalition doctrine taught about maintaining an effective fighting force. We removed soldiers who showed signs of grief or fear from active duty, believing such states made them unreliable. The humans seemed to build their entire fighting force from people who felt exactly those things, every single day, and simply continued regardless. I began to understand, during those weeks aboard that ship, that we had made a critical error in how we assessed humanity before this war ever began. We had measured them by the standards of species who saw peace as the goal and war as the failure. Humans did not share that framework. For them, the goal was survival, and war was simply one of the many forms survival sometimes required. They did not need to overcome their fear to fight. They had never known a version of themselves without it. I asked Daniel Hart, near the end of my time in that section of the ship, whether he believed his people would eventually grow tired of this war, whether there would come a point where the cost became too great to continue. He considered the question carefully before answering, in a way that told me he had thought about it many times before. He said that humans had never stopped fighting simply because a war became difficult. He said the wars that ended were the ones that were won, or the ones where the reason for fighting disappeared entirely. Difficulty alone, he said, had never once been enough. I did not know, at the time, how completely that statement would be proven true in the weeks that followed, as the war moved beyond these early engagements and into something far larger than anything Threll or our command structure had ever prepared us to face. I was transferred to a secure facility on one of their outer stations not long after that period aboard the ship, and it was there that I began to understand the true scale of what humanity was building in response to our arrival. What had started as a single fleet engagement had grown, over the following months, into something that our coalition records had no proper category for. I learned, through conversations with the guards assigned to my section and from fragments of information shared with the other prisoners, that humanity had converted almost the entirety of their industrial capacity toward the war effort within the first several weeks of the conflict. Factories that had produced goods for ordinary civilian life were now producing ship components, weapons, and equipment at a pace that our own coalition analysts would have considered impossible for a species at their level of development. This was not simply a matter of speed. It was a matter of complete and total commitment, from every level of their society, toward a single purpose. I asked one of the guards, a quiet man who rarely spoke more than necessary, how ordinary citizens felt about giving so much of their lives over to this effort. He told me that most of them did not see it as giving anything up. He said that when survival is the question, the answer stops feeling like a sacrifice and starts feeling like the only reasonable thing to do. The coalition response to this shift was to escalate our own commitment, and I learned that Threll, along with the surviving command structure, had petitioned for a much larger force to be sent, one intended to end the conflict quickly through sheer scale rather than continued tactical engagement. I do not know the full details of what followed, since my access to information was limited during this period, but I understood from later conversations that a significant portion of the Coalition's regional fleet had been redirected toward the human system, intended to overwhelm their defenses entirely. What happened instead became, according to several of the humans I later spoke with, one of the defining moments of the entire conflict. The Coalition fleet arrived expecting minimal organized resistance beyond what remained of humanity's primary defense force, based on estimates of losses from the earlier engagements. Instead, they found a defense network that had grown far beyond anything detected before, built not only from new construction, but from every occupied territory humanity controlled, all of it coordinated into a single, unified strategy. I learned the details of this engagement slowly, through pieces of conversation, and later through records I was eventually permitted to review. The Coalition fleet, vastly superior in raw numbers, attempted a direct assault on one of humanity's primary shipyards, believing that destroying their production capacity would end the war through simple attrition. Humanity's response was not to defend the shipyard with everything they had. Instead, they allowed a significant portion of it to be destroyed, drawing the Coalition fleet deep into a defensive position that had been prepared long before the attack began. Once the Coalition ships were fully committed to the assault, human forces that had been positioned in surrounding systems moved to cut off their supply lines and retreat routes entirely, trapping a large portion of the attacking fleet within a defensive perimeter they could not easily escape. What followed was not a battle in the traditional sense. It became a war of attrition within a confined space, where humanity's willingness to accept losses in exchange for permanently crippling Coalition capability proved far greater than anything our command structure had planned for. I learned later that human commanders made a deliberate decision during this engagement to accept significant losses among their own forces in exchange for guaranteeing that the trapped Coalition fleet would not be able to withdraw with enough strength to threaten them again. This idea of choosing to accept heavy losses not to win a single battle, but to guarantee an advantage in the larger war, was something our own doctrine had never prepared us to counter. Coalition strategy was built around preserving forces whenever possible, retreating from unfavorable engagements to fight again under better conditions. Humanity, when the situation called for it, was willing to treat their own losses as an investment rather than a cost to be avoided. I spoke with a woman named Emma Clark during this period, who had served aboard one of the vessels involved in that engagement and had been transferred to the same facility where I was being held, working in a support role after an injury had ended her active service. She described the battle to me not with pride or excitement, but with a kind of quiet exhaustion that told me more about its true cost than any casualty report could have. She told me that the hardest part was not the fighting itself, but the decisions made before it, the moment when commanders had to choose which losses were acceptable in exchange for a larger outcome. She said that everyone involved understood, going into that engagement, that many of them would not survive it, and that this understanding did not stop a single one of them from taking their position when the time came. I asked her how humans could make peace with a decision like that, choosing to accept losses so significant in pursuit of something that would not benefit the people making that sacrifice directly. She told me that it was not about individual benefit. She said that every person in that battle understood they were fighting for something larger than their own survival, and that this understanding was the only thing that made the decision bearable at all. This distinction between fighting for personal survival and fighting for something that extended beyond any single life was something I had not fully grasped until that conversation. Our own coalition forces fought to preserve themselves and their immediate objectives. Humanity, it seemed, had learned to fight for outcomes that might only be realized long after the individuals fighting for them were gone. The coalition fleet that had been trapped during that engagement suffered losses severe enough that our command structure was forced to reconsider the entire approach to this war. I learned through later conversations that the survivors of that battle, including several senior officers, had petitioned for a complete withdrawal from human space, arguing that continued engagement would only lead to further losses without any clear path toward the surrender we had originally expected. This request was denied, At least initially, and additional forces were committed to the conflict in an attempt to recover what had been lost. But I understood, even from my limited position as a prisoner with restricted access to information, that something fundamental had shifted in how the coalition viewed this war. We were no longer treating humanity as a species to be absorbed with minimal effort. We were beginning to treat them as a threat that might not be defeated through conventional means at all. I asked Daniel Hart, during a brief period when I was permitted contact with him again, whether he believed the coalition would eventually withdraw entirely, given the losses they had already suffered. He told me that he did not know, and that this uncertainty was, in some ways, the most difficult part of the entire conflict. He said that humans had learned to endure long wars, but that enduring did not mean they had learned to enjoy them, or that the toll of continued fighting did not weigh on every person still standing. I want to be clear about something, because I believe it is important to the truth I am trying to explain. The humans I encountered during this period were not eager for continued conflict. They did not celebrate the losses inflicted on our fleet, and I never once heard any of them speak with satisfaction about the deaths of coalition soldiers, even soldiers who had been sent to conquer their world. What I witnessed instead was a grim, steady determination to see the conflict through to whatever end was necessary, regardless of the personal cost involved. This determination did not come from a lack of feeling. It came from a history that had taught every single one of them, long before this war began, that stopping simply because something became difficult was never actually an option that led anywhere good. I began to understand, during this period, that humanity's greatest strength in this war was not their weapons, their tactics, or even their industrial capacity, though all of those things played a significant role in what followed. Their greatest strength was a complete unwillingness to treat difficulty as a reason to surrender, an unwillingness so deeply woven into who they were that it did not need to be taught or enforced. It simply existed, in nearly every person I encountered, from senior officers like Grace Turner to quiet guards who rarely spoke more than a few words at a time. I did not fully understand the implications of this until the final months of the conflict, when the war reached a point that even I, a prisoner with limited access to information, could sense was approaching some kind of resolution. What that resolution turned out to be was something I could not have predicted, even after everything I had already witnessed. I am back in the room now, the one with the 3 officials across the table from me, and I understand that what I am about to explain is the part they have been waiting to hear since this conversation began. They want to know why the war ended the way it did. I will tell them exactly what I told myself, over and over, in the final weeks before it was over. The coalition committed one final major effort to end the conflict, gathering what remained of our regional forces along with reinforcements drawn from further across our territory, intending to overwhelm humanity's defenses through a scale of attack that had never been attempted against any species before. I learned of this plan only in fragments, since my access to information remained limited, but I understood enough to know that our command structure believed this would finally force the surrender we had expected from the very beginning. What I witnessed instead was not a surrender. It was something far stranger and far more unsettling than anything that had come before it. Humanity's response to this final coalition offensive was not simply another display of tactical brilliance or industrial capacity, though both were present in abundance. It was a complete restructuring of how they approached the war itself. Rather than meeting the coalition fleet head-on, as they had in previous engagements, human forces began a coordinated withdrawal from several outer territories, consolidating their defenses around a smaller number of heavily fortified positions. I did not understand this strategy at first, and neither did most of the coalition officers I later spoke with. It looked, from a distance, like exactly the kind of retreat we had been expecting since the beginning of the war, the moment where humanity finally accepted that continued resistance was pointless. Several coalition commanders reportedly celebrated this withdrawal as the beginning of the end, believing that humanity's will to fight had finally been broken by the scale of the forces committed against them. I learned the truth of what was actually happening from Grace Turner herself, during one of the final conversations we shared before the war reached its conclusion. She had been transferred to oversee the facility where I was being held, and she spoke with me directly, without the careful distance she had maintained during our earlier encounters. She told me that the withdrawal had never been about giving up ground. It had been about controlling exactly where the final confrontation would take place. By consolidating their forces into a smaller number of heavily defended positions, humanity had created a situation where the coalition's numerical advantage became far less significant than the terrain and preparation of the battlefield itself. Every position they held had been fortified for months in preparation for exactly this scenario, built with the understanding that a final coalition offensive was inevitable, and that meeting it on ground of humanity's choosing would matter more than meeting it with equal or greater numbers. The final battle, when it came, was unlike anything in our coalition's long history of conflict. I did not witness it directly, but I have since spoken with several people who did, including Grace Turner, Daniel Hart, and even Emma Clark, who had returned to active duty despite her earlier injuries. What they described to me was not a battle won through overwhelming force, but one won through absolute precision, patience, and a willingness to let the coalition's own aggression work against them. Human forces allowed the coalition fleet to commit fully to an assault on their primary defensive position before revealing the true extent of their preparations, systems, and defenses that had been kept hidden throughout the earlier stages of the war, specifically for this moment. By the time the coalition command realized the scale of what they were facing, their fleet was already deeply engaged, unable to withdraw without suffering catastrophic losses in the attempt. I want to describe what happened next as carefully as I can, because I believe this is the moment that finally broke our coalition's understanding of this war entirely. Rather than pressing their advantage to destroy the trapped coalition fleet completely, as our own doctrine would have expected from a victorious force, humanity's commanders made a different choice. They offered terms. I did not understand this at first, when I learned of it, and neither did most of the coalition survivors I later spoke with. We had expected, if humanity ever gained a decisive advantage, that they would use it to eliminate the threat we posed entirely, given everything we had done to their world and their people throughout the conflict. Instead, once the coalition fleet was fully trapped and unable to continue fighting effectively, human command offered a path toward ending the war that did not require the complete destruction of the forces they had defeated. I asked Grace Turner directly why humanity chose this path, when they clearly had the capability to end the coalition's presence in their system entirely. Her answer stayed with me longer than almost anything else I heard during my time among them. She told me that humanity had learned, through their own long and difficult history, that wars which end through complete destruction of the losing side rarely stay ended. She said that an enemy given no path forward except annihilation will fight until there is nothing left to fight with, and that this kind of ending costs far more than it is worth, even for the side that wins. She told me that humanity had chosen instead to end this war in a way that left something standing on both sides, not out of weakness or mercy in the way our coalition understood that word, but out of a clear understanding that a war which never truly ends is far more costly than one that concludes with both sides still able to build something afterward. This decision, more than any battle or tactic I had witnessed throughout the entire conflict, was the moment I finally understood the full truth about humanity that I have been trying to explain since this conversation began. Humans were not dangerous simply because of their weapons, their industrial capacity, or their tactical intelligence, though all of these things had proven far greater than our coalition had ever expected. They were dangerous because they had built an entire civilization around the understanding that fear does not excuse inaction, that difficulty does not justify surrender, and that even total victory did not require total destruction if a better path existed. Our coalition had entered this war believing that humanity's internal conflicts made them weak, disorganized, and easy to conquer. What we found instead was a species whose entire history of conflict had taught them exactly how to endure, adapt, and ultimately choose the shape of their own victory, even when facing a force that should have overwhelmed them entirely. The terms humanity offered were accepted by what remained of our coalition command, and the war that had begun with such confidence on our part ended not with humanity's surrender, but with a negotiated peace that acknowledged their independence and their right to defend their own space without further coalition interference. I do not know all the details of what was agreed to during those final negotiations, since my role throughout this conflict remained that of a prisoner rather than a participant in its resolution. What I do know is this. In the months that followed the end of active fighting, I was eventually released along with the other coalition prisoners, returned through a formal exchange process that Grace Turner herself helped oversee. Before I left the facility, where I had spent so much of the war, she spoke with me one final time, and I have thought about her words many times since then. She told me that she hoped our coalition would remember this war not as a story of humanity's cruelty or humanity's strength, but as a lesson about what happens when one civilization assumes it understands another before truly trying to know it. She told me that humanity had never wanted this war, had never sought out conflict with our coalition, but had simply refused to disappear quietly once that conflict was forced upon them. I am telling you all of this now, in this room, because I believe it is the truth you actually need to understand, more than any tactical detail about ship formations or weapon systems. Humanity is not dangerous because they are cruel, and they are not dangerous because they lack fear. They are dangerous because they have spent their entire history learning how to keep moving forward despite fear, despite loss, despite odds that would have caused any other species we have encountered to surrender long before the true fighting ever began. And perhaps the most unsettling truth of all is this. When humanity finally held the power to end our coalition's presence in their system completely, they chose not to use that power beyond what was necessary to secure their own safety. They stopped, not because they lacked the strength to continue, but because they had already decided, long before that final battle ever began, exactly what kind of victory they were willing to accept. I do not know what the future holds for the relationship between our coalition and the human species. I do not know whether this peace will last, or whether some future conflict will bring our two peoples back into confrontation once again. What I do know, and what I have tried to explain as clearly as I can throughout this entire account, is that we made a grave error in how we understood humanity before this war ever began. We assumed that a species divided against itself could not stand united against an outside threat. We assumed that fear would make them fragile, that loss would make them yield, and that overwhelming force would eventually convince them that surrender was their only reasonable option. Every single one of those assumptions proved false, not because humanity is without weakness, but because their history had already prepared them for exactly the kind of struggle we brought to their doorstep. If our coalition ever considers another confrontation with humanity, I would offer only one piece of advice, drawn from everything I witnessed during my time among them. Do not measure them by how strong they appear before the fighting begins. Measure them by how long they are willing to continue after everyone else would have already stopped. That is the truth about humans in war, and it is the truth I have carried with me since the day I was finally allowed to go home.